Hi there, this is Brittany from By Brittany Goldwyn. I post videos about plants and projects, and today we're going to be talking about refinishing wood furniture. So this is a complete beginner's guide. We're going to be working on something really simple, this C-shaped end table that I picked up at Goodwill recently for $5. But as you can see, the top needs quite a bit of work. Now, I got inspired to do this because I just filmed a tour of some of the thrifted items in my house. I know I mostly am posting plant content on here. I'm still kind of trying to figure out how much project content I want to be sharing. But I also know that there are a lot of plant people who love thrifted, upcycled type things. So if you're new to refinishing wood furniture, this is a great place to start. So let's start with sanding. Now for a piece this small, you really could sand this by hand. I had carpal tunnel surgery on one of my wrists a year and a half ago, and I probably need it on the other wrist, so I like to minimize any hand sanding I'm doing. If you are doing hand sanding, I recommend getting some sort of a sanding block to use just to help spread out that pressure on your hand. If you want the job to go faster though, you'll need to get something like this orbital sander. So this orbital sander is a cordless DeWalt orbital sander. I chose it because we already have the batteries for our drills, nail guns, multi-tools, all sorts of other stuff. But I had a much cheaper corded Black & Decker orbital sander that I will link below for many years before I invested in this one. And honestly, it was still working great when I handed it off to someone else. The only reason I upgraded it is because I wanted the cordless option. So if you're looking to invest in your first orbital sander, I do think the Black & Decker corded one is a great option. Now, if you're hand sanding something, I do think it's possible to do it indoors. Make sure you wear a mask while you are hand sanding. If you're orbital sanding, I recommend doing it outside, which is why I am outside right now when it is 28 degrees outside. The sanding dust just goes everywhere. I still wear a mask when I'm sanding outside just to be super safe. You're never really sure what you're sanding down, what the finish is, what the type of wood is a lot of the time. So always wear a mask, and if you are orbital sanding, make sure you do it outside. So today I'm going to be working with two different sanding discs. I'm going to be working with a 120 and a 220. I'll use the 120 first because the lower the number, the bigger the grit on the sanding disc, so the more it will kind of rough up the surface you are working with. Now, it doesn't look like I have much of a finish to remove on this, but there are quite a few water spots and other bad areas. So I'll start off trying to get all of those off with the 120 stuck to the bottom of my orbital sander, and then after I'm done, I will move up to the 220 to polish it and make sure it's nice and smooth for a new finish. All right, so about 10 minutes later with the 120 grit sandpaper, I have sanded the finish completely off, and you can see all of those water stains were gone. There is a little bit of discoloration, what might look like discoloration on the camera. It does appear that this is just wood grain on here. I was unable to sand that out, but that's fine. I think it'll really blend in once I stain it. So I sanded down the sides as well. So I popped off the 120 grit sandpaper and replaced it with a 220 so I can smooth everything out and prepare this piece for a stain. Now, while I'm working with the 220 grit sandpaper, since I've already removed all of the yucky stuff, you're not gonna see much of a difference, but if you could feel the wood, you would feel a difference between sanding with the 220 grit, sanding with the 120 grit, and then sanding with the 220 grit to finish things off. Now, I would say I'm gonna run inside to do this last part, but I'm already out here, and I'm already a little dusty, and I already have the sandpaper. So, I took off the 220 piece that I was just using to smooth everything out. And what I'm gonna do is just do some minor hand sanding along these corners. Now, if it's a bigger piece, I usually just do this with the orbital sander because it's easy. Get all those extra splinters off here. Any of the rough spots or uneven spots from when you were sanding. Just use what's left of this. And you can use these discs more than once. It really just depends on the complexity and how much sanding you're doing with them on a project. But this was a brand new disc, and this was not a very big project. It was very easy to remove this finish. So I will be able to throw this back in the bag to use again. So I'm just breaking down these edges here, smoothing them out a little. Then you can see here, there's a little, see that little splinter piece, just to get those kind of off. So you're not giving yourself any splinters when you're working on this. Get these corners as the last step, making sure we're smoothing out any areas that are looking a little prickly. And then I'll probably give this another once over inside when I'm working on staining it, just to make sure I'm not missing any areas as I hastily sand out here by hand in the cold. All right, let's head inside. Okay, we're back inside, and the next step is to wipe down whatever you've sanded. Since this is a small piece, it is pretty easy to wipe it down, get everything, all the excess dust off. Now, the best practice with this is to use a rag like I'm using. This is just a piece of an old t-shirt that I cut up. Instead of throwing away, use them for stuff like this, for staining, for cleanup. Wipe down with a rag and then use tack cloth to get all of the little pieces of dust that you don't see on here. So tack cloth is like cheesecloth, except it has like a sticky residue on it, so that when you run it over a piece of wood that you've sanded, it will pick up all those teeny tiny pieces of dust that you may be missing or just kind of spreading around with your rag. Now, use tack cloth. I'm not going to use tack cloth today because I don't have any and I don't use it all the time. It really depends on the piece. But I'm just gonna try and do as good of a job as I can, wiping this down with a rag and then using a clean rag after that to see if I can get everything off before staining it. And here is what our piece looks like, all wiped down. You can see all of those water stains are gone. It's got a really nice smooth sheen. I hope you can see the light bouncing off of that when I move it back and forth. And we are ready for stain. Now for stain, I'm using an oil-based minwax stain. It started off as English chestnut, but I've actually dumped a couple random similarly colored stains in here to consolidate for this piece because I'm not too particular about what exact shade of brown this is. I just want it to be a nice medium dark brown. So I'm dipping a rag in here. This is another clean rag, and you can definitely use a brush, but for smaller pieces like this, I find that a rag is super easy to use and it allows you to spread the stain out very evenly. So I'm just going to show you a close-up shot of me just gently wiping the stain on here. And once I run out, I will dip it in again and continue wiping. Now you want to let the stain soak in for, I would say, a couple minutes. That really depends on the type of wood you're working with, how porous it is. This wood seems to be a relatively porous wood, so I am going to do a coat here, an even coat all over, and then I will let this dry probably overnight. Probably will not need to do any wiping on this one because it seems to be sucking up all of the stain pretty well. If a piece has extra stain on it, it will not dry properly unless you wipe all of it off. And that is actually another reason why I like working with a rag, because it allows me to kind of spread it out evenly and not have a ton of excess stain when I'm done with the project. So I've done most of the top. I like to squeeze the rag into these little areas that need a little bit of extra help getting the stain in. And looks like we've got the top mostly done. Everything spread out pretty evenly. Give you a look here at what this looks like. And now I'm going to do the same thing to the edges. I just finished applying the stain to this and wiping up all of the excess, and I also wanted to mention that a lot of people will recommend using a wood conditioner on your piece of unfinished wood before applying the stain. What a wood conditioner does is just helps the stain to soak into the wood more evenly. Now, I did not use wood conditioner on this piece just because I don't have it on hand and the piece is so small that I did not feel like I should go out and get it. And honestly, I've only used it a handful of times in my life for wood finishing projects and have had pretty good results. So if I can simplify the steps, that's what I'm going to be doing. But if you are having issues with the stain applying in a way that you like, in a uniform way, you may want to consider a wood conditioner. container. For this one, I'm going to let this stain dry overnight, see how it looks tomorrow morning to determine how I want to proceed, if I want to add a second coat or if I want to move along to finishing. All right, we are checking in about 24 hours later and it's looking really lovely. The stain is completely dried and I'm happy with how it looks, so we're going to move on to adding the finish coat. Now, I'm working with a Varathane Ultimate Polyurethane. This is oil-based in a satin finish. I love a clear satin finish on a lot of my pieces. I don't like anything too high gloss or too matte, so satin is generally going to be a really good choice for me. And I'm wearing a mask because it's oil-based. Oil-based finishes smell nasty. Much like the oil-based wood stain, oil-based urethanes smell really, really bad. So since I'm working inside, I've already got my mask on. I do prefer using water-based finishes generally for working indoors, but since I didn't have any on hand and this is what I have, this is what I'm going to use. And with oil-based finishes, all finishes really, but especially oil-based finishes, they do tend to have a bit of separation when they sit on the shelf for a while. So I do recommend giving them a thorough mixing before you use them. Now, while I recommended using a rag for applying a stain on a piece this small, I'm going to be using a brush for the finish. I would not recommend using a rag to apply your finish. Now, I may get roasted for using this little foam brush to apply the finish, but I find that oil-based finishes are so self-settling. They will level out themselves so much that any sort of brush is really fine. And these things are so cheap that if I am stuck using an oil-based finish, I don't have to worry about cleaning them out afterward and I can just chuck them. So right now I'm just dipping a little bit of the finish into the can. And on a small piece like this, I'm also deciding just to dip directly into the can and not to really worry about dumping some finish into another container to dirty that up with oil-based finish as well. So I'm just gently brushing this on here. And as I said, with oil-based finishes, they really self-level a lot. So just aim to get a roughly even coat onto your piece. Watch for drips along the edges. I have this piece sitting up on something to elevate it off the workbench, and so it's wobbling all around. That's what the wobble is here. And now I am pretty happy with how the top looks. Oh, you can see how pretty it looks. So I'm going to go in and brush down the sides now. Again, watching for drips. Now, when you are working with an oil-based finish, it's definitely possible that you will put it on the top and all four of the sides I've got here. Wait about 30 seconds, look back and see that you've got some drips coming down the edges. So what you want to do is once you're finished and you've waited like probably 30 seconds to a minute, check the edges to see if you have any minor drips, and the finish is still definitely workable enough to smooth any of them out. So I'm just checking for those here. Okay, and that's our first coat. Now that the first coat on our finish is dry, I'll show you how this looks. It's starting to look really nice and polished. But if you look closely, you'll be able to see that there are some minor imperfections in it. These are little air bubbles that have escaped and popped as that first coat was drying. So what we're going to do before putting on the second coat of polyurethane is use a piece of super fine grit sandpaper. This is just a piece of 400 grit sandpaper designed for finish coats. Now I will take this and just gently sand very lightly all over the piece to pop those little air bubbles. I'll do this all over the top, and then I will do it on the side. And then I will show you some close-ups, because after I do this sanding coat, it is definitely more obvious where those little imperfections were in the piece. After you sand down all of those areas, you just want to give the piece a nice, good wipe down, just like you did after sanding it, to remove all of the dust you generated. I think at this angle you can kind of see some of these popped air bubbles here when the light hits it, but this is what I mean about the little imperfect surfaces that you are breaking up, sanding during this portion. Now here's a quick little tip if you are doing many coats of an oil-based finish simultaneously, so within like a day or two. I just take a piece of aluminum foil and wrap up the brush I'm using so it stays wet, nice and malleable, and I can reuse it. I don't have to wash it since oil-based stains and finishes are such a pain to wash. I can just reuse this until I'm done the project. And now I'm just going to repeat what I did with the first coat. So I'm going to gently apply a second coat of this oil-based finish and hopefully deal with no air bubbles this second time around when this is drying. Now my finish does suggest 2 to 3 coats. I'm probably going to do 2 coats on this piece. If I have some residual air bubbles after I do the second coat, I will lightly sand those down and do a third coat. But generally, with this type of finish, I'm fine with 2 coats unless it's like a super high traffic piece that I want to add additional protection to. Now that our final finish coat is done, it's looking really lovely. I'm super happy with how it turned out, so I'm going to flip this over on my workbench and reattach it to the bottom using the 4 screws it came with. Now at first I had thought that I wanted to paint this base black, which is actually funny because when you remove it, you can see that it was originally black before someone painted it gold. But I think I'm going to keep it gold for now because our TV frame upstairs is gold, and I think it'll look really nice next to that, and I think that's where I'm going to keep it. So I'm going to use my drill to reattach the top here, and then we'll flip it over and take a look. And I would say that is a pretty impressive glow up for a $5 Goodwill table. All right, that wraps up my quick and dirty video about how to refinish wood for absolute beginners. I hope this helps you figure out a way that you can refinish your thrifted wood finds. I love refinishing things. I love having pieces that I put my heart into, that I'm proud to have in my home, and that I probably didn't pay a lot of money for. So if you have any questions, please feel free to drop them in the comments below. Otherwise, I'll see you on my next video. Bye-bye.